Chapter 27 Pets. No, we don't live on a farm. Man, I wish I could find my very first diary. It was a little paperback book that you could order through elementary schools when they'd hand out those amazing little book catalog, leaflet things each month. Sell books to help raise money for the school, that sort of thing. I wanted books so bad, but it took a lot of finessing to get Mom to actually order any books. Mom was a big proponent for the library. She thought it was dumb to actually buy books when you could simply go to the library, take out as many books as you want, read to your heart's content, and then simply return them. For free. Plus, Mom was frugal, and we rarely got stuff just for fun. Every now and then, though, I could wear Mom down enough to get me something, like the odd tantalizing books on book sale days. So yeah, I believe I was 11 when I got that thin, cheap little book. It had "My Diary" on the front cover, and I guess it was meant to look like some youth had scrawled that themselves. There was a little drawing of a lock, where real diaries would have real locks, and some other appropriate graffiti on the front like, "Hands off" and "Keep out." I had to have it. The pages were made from that cheap, shit, grayish paper that has that weird smooth texture that is actually resistant to pencils. Each page was pre-divided into little entry subsections, and they were only big enough for a few sentences. Tough shit if you had a lot to say on any given day. I thought it was awesome. My earliest foray into those initial attempts to pour out my heart in written words. I mean, don't get too excited. A lot of it probably had some really lame shit like, "bored today," or "no cute boys," or "my brother is a jerk," or "Jay is the cutest boy in the world." That same kind of junk that I basically spewed out onto paper for years, but in a much more concise style of prose. Anyway, one of my favorite entries was about the death of one of my guppies. It was something like, "A guppy died today. I don't understand why life is so cruel." I mean, I don't want to downplay the importance of a guppy, or my own young, deep feelings, but it was a guppy, and that was some stellar melodramatic kid angst. I don't know why it turned out that way, but we had a lot of pets for some reason over the years. At one point in time, I was taking inventory, and we had 5 ducks, a couple of geese, rabbits, a cat, a dog, and some fish. And when I'd say this out loud, I'd always get some kid at school looking at me with a confused face, and they'd always ask, "Do you live on a farm?" No, I don't live on a farm. Brother had a friend who lived on a small farm, and he got the ducks from that friend. I will never know how we managed to always con Mom into letting us bring these pets home. She'd always be groaning with anguish over more pets, and yet we'd have more pets. So teen brother had these 5 ducklings, and it was completely, ridiculously cute and exciting. 4 boys and 1 girl. We had a little kiddie pool all set up for them, and as soon as they were plunked into the pool, they went nuts with joy and excitement. It was the most ridiculous thing. They were splashing and darting underwater and paddling round that little pool with great feverish speed and flapping their little downy immature wings. What a sight! I learned something that day. It only takes a very short amount of time for ducks to make sparkling clean water browny green and filthy. Ducks and geese shit non-stop. We had a shed at the back of the yard, and Brother, with his woodworking skills, got to work building them a shelter. He built a hutch on the left side of the shed, complete with its own little incline ramp and hinged lid. He dug a hole in their little side yard and sunk the little pool into it, creating their own little in-ground swimming pool. He and Dad fenced in the area to keep them safe and secure at night when they'd be tucked away in their little straw-covered hutch until the next day when they could be let out to roam free in the yard. Problem was, we weren't the best at cleaning up after our pets, and that little pool would become pretty foul by the time it was hauled out to be scrubbed and cleaned. Another problem was that Brother thought it was fun to kind of teach them to fly, and they learned a little too well. It wasn't long before the fully matured ducks were off enjoying the far backyard of one of our neighbors about 3 or 4 houses down. All of those extended backyards that were bought would become boggy after enough rain and stay that way for a while. We'd see the ducks off happily splashing and rooting around in the distance. Brother or I would plug our noses and quack at them to call them. Their nosy little heads would pop up from whatever they would be doing. Then they'd be chattering away amongst themselves, start running for takeoff, and fly back to our yard. I wonder, come to think of it, if that neighbor even realized those ducks were pets. We had 2 sets of ducks actually, and 2 large white geese with the second set. Geese are a little meaner and less snuggly than ducks in general, but they were still pretty neat. One day we heard a knock at the back door, and when I went to check, it was the geese standing there, curiously tilting their heads to the side to look at me and then casually saunter off back into the yard. I was obsessed with rabbits for a while as a kid, and whenever we had some free time to draw at school, I was drawing bunnies. I got a bunny for a pet. It was an older lady rabbit. She was black with white patches. Dad made her a hutch for her initial home, which we kept down the basement at first. One day I went to go check on my new bunny, but she was nowhere to be found. There was a hole in the chicken wire of her hutch, but I couldn't find her. After a bit of hunting around, I found her in a dim corner of the basement. Some leftover pieces of drywall and other assorted junk had been stacked in the back corner, and there was a dark little tented space within the lean. As I peered through, I could see my bunny, but something else was moving in the shadows. I called Mom. "Mom, I found the rabbit, and I think she had babies." Mom: "No, really? Oh my God." Mom came down to see for herself and was shocked and probably rather horrified to find that we did indeed have a litter of baby bunnies. Okay, it wasn't the best, and Mom was in a bit of despair, but it was pretty freaking exciting. The poor rabbit! We didn't even know she was pregnant. In her desperation before giving birth, she'd chewed right through that chicken wire, hunted around in the rec room, found a suitable corner, ripped some fiberglass insulation out of the unfinished room wall, and tried to make a soft nest for her babies. She was named Mumsy thereafter. The babies were ridiculously cute. We couldn't keep them all, but we kept a white bunny with black markings on her and named her Puff Puff. Puff Puff had a black ring around one eye and a marking on her one side that looked kind of like a rabbit paw print. Dad's animal-loving brother came over to affirm the gender of the bunny we wanted to keep as Mumsy's companion. This called for some quick adjustments to the housing situation. On the right side of the far shed, Dad built a large hutch on the outside for fresh air, all wire, with the idea that the poops would fall through to the ground. And he made a cozy indoor space filled with straw for the bunnies to go in when it got cold. One main problem was that the bunnies actually enjoyed pooping in the indoor part more than the outdoor part. We also didn't realize that Mumsy was an old lady rabbit, and she passed away before long. We needed a companion for Puff Puff, so once again my uncle found a rabbit friend. He checked the bunny over, and it was a girl, so we wouldn't have to worry about more bunnies. Only it wasn't a girl, and one day we found a litter of bunnies in the indoor room. In that litter we discovered a baby that had been forgotten under the rest of the litter and had died, and a weak little runt in the corner. We were horrified. Mom fixed up a box with a soft towel in it, and she tried to feed that little rabbit often. She even got up in the night to try to feed it with an eyedropper, but by morning it had died. This crushed Mom. It was clear how upsetting she found it, even though Mum never cried. Mr. Cottontail, now identified as a male rabbit, would have to live in the shed away from Puff Puff. We had a very smart little dog as well back then named Spooky. He was a little black poodle terrier mutt. He was a nice dog, and enjoyed escaping from our property as often as his cunning little self could manage it. You know, though, it was pretty freaking common in the 70s and 80s to see dogs on the loose. I feel like it was a lot more common than nowadays. There often seemed to be some scary big dog out tooting around the neighborhood. It could be pretty unsettling, but hopefully it was never a German Shepherd. Those were the dreaded dogs when I was a kid, top of the list of feared dogs at that time. One wintry day, Brother was walking home and spotted a loose German Shepherd not too far from him up the street. It spotted him and started running. Brother broke into a horrified sprint, turned onto our driveway, running with all his might. He hit the fatal last corner turn to make it to the back door, hit some ice, and went sprawling to the ground. He said he could clearly imagine he felt the hot breath and sharp teeth at his neck and waited for death, but for whatever reason the dog hadn't actually followed him down the driveway. Spooky had gotten a taste of freedom one day and had discovered he liked it very, very much. He'd scratch the door to go out for a pee, and when no one was watching, he'd sneakily head for a tear in the fence. If he was lucky, he'd be off and gone for a while, having the doggy time of his life, apparently. We don't really know what he'd get up to for the most part, probably digging around through someone's garbage, but we did know one bit of mischief he'd get up to. We had a neighbor just a couple of houses down who had a fancier, moppy dog that they'd put out in the driveway for fresh air on a leash that was attached to their garage. The older man came over one day, pissed off, to give Dad hell and to keep your dog on a leash because he keeps coming over and stealing my dog's bones. I guess you can't blame him. So there would be Spooky, once again, out pretending to take a leak, but starting to head stealthily for his getaway hole, and we'd be at the back door watching him, open it up and yell, "Hey, get back here!" His little dog shoulders would actually schlump, and he'd look so guilty. When Brother and I were kids, we enjoyed dressing Spooky in a pair of my pajamas I'd grown out of. It was a pink two-piece set of shorts and t-shirt. We thought it was ridiculous how he looked in those clothes. Toddler's sister was obsessed with Spooky, and has been obsessed with dogs her whole life. And she'd cart him around endlessly and force him to sit with her on the chair or the couch. She'd be constantly trucking that dog around, and he'd look so woebegone, pleading silently to us with mournful eyes to get me away from this kid. That poor little dog would have seizures every now and then. His body would contort and he'd be unable to walk for a moment. I hated when he had seizures, and I'd pet him and try to say reassuring things until they passed. Not only did that dog love being outside on the loose, Dad, for some reason, refused to fork out the dough to get Spooky a proper dog license. According to the pet rules of the time, Spooky should have been wearing a collar with his proper tags, but as I've mentioned, my parents were frugal. Spooky loved Dad an awful lot, so he'd generally be hanging out with Dad whenever Dad was outside, and never on a leash, because he only tried to disappear when he was on his own. One time Mum heard Spooky howling away and looked out the window in time to see Dad racing into the backyard with Spooky in his arms to hide him, since the dog catcher was in the neighborhood, and Dad didn't want to get nabbed for not having made sure Spooky had his proper tags. The sudden alarmness from Dad was so palpable to Spooky that he started howling, knowing something was amiss, but what that was, he couldn't say. One time Brother had forgotten to secure the ducks for the night. Mum, up late, heard some sort of commotion off in the distance, but didn't think too much of it. The next morning, the ducks were nowhere to be found. Brother called and called to them, but they wouldn't fly home. Once they had accidentally overshot our yard and flew over the fence into the factory lot behind, and Brother had had to walk all the way around, trespass onto the factory property, and carefully toss them over the high fence topped with barbed wire back into our yard. So he checked to see if they'd accidentally flown over to the factory again, but they weren't there. He went for a search through the backyards, and he found them. They were all dead and had been torn apart. We guessed that a dog had done it. Dad was good once in a while for a very dramatic and uncomforting zinger, and he baldly told us, "Once a dog gets a taste for blood, they're no good anymore." It was horrific. Mum was beyond upset, and once again passionately affirmed that she never wanted any more pets. We couldn't believe what had happened. Those good, smart, sweet little ducks. All dead, except Girl Duck. Mom felt guilty for ages that she had heard something that night and had never gone outside to investigate. It wasn't long after that I came home one day in time to see some animal, something large and dark, slinking off from my rabbit hutch. I ran in horror to see if they were all right. Puff Puff and all of her little babies were all just lying on the wire floor of the outside hutch. There was nothing visibly wrong with them, but they were all dead. I can picture them all still, just lying there, Only Mr. Cottontail remained, safe from harm inside the shed. Dad surmised that they had been scared, literally, to death. Kitty found us when I was 13. She was a black and white tuxedo cat of about a year old, and she just started coming around one day. I and the neighbor kids were delighted. Such a lovely cat. But then she kept on hanging out. "Mom, can we give the kitty some milk?" "No, if we give it some milk, it'll never go away." And then the cat just kept hanging around, so Mom let us give the cat some milk. "Mom, can we give the kitty some food? The kitty must be hungry." "No, if we feed it, it will never leave." But the cat kept sticking around, and Mom didn't exactly want the cat to starve to death either, so a can of tuna was eventually cracked open. And it just progressed from there, with Mom desperately wishing that cat would remember that it belonged to someone else, but eventually that cat being allowed to come into our house. Nobody ever came to claim her, and there were no missing cat posters around. We soon had an infestation of fleas and saw that the cat had a tapeworm. Mom had had it with pets and tried to take a stand and decide enough was enough. She tried to reason with me that we just couldn't keep the cat, and I reluctantly agreed, even though I did not want to, and Dad took poor Kitty off to the Humane Society, and I started crying and couldn't stop. I spent a couple of days crying and drawing pictures of Kitty with hearts around her. I was inconsolable. Mom and Dad couldn't take it. Dad went to the Humane Society, but they refused to give him back the cat, as there were rules and a waiting period to see if Kitty's supposed owner, if there was one, would come claim her. Dad lamented this to his mother on the phone. Nanny was not the kind of person who took no for an answer, and she got Papa, and they drove over there, and well, she got me back my cat. Suddenly Papa was coming in our back door, grumbling and swearing, holding a writhing, furious ball of cat with all the claws and teeth happening, twisting and contorting to attack him. He managed to get her into the house and flung her away from him. Kitty went scuttling away down the basement. Papa's hands were shredded. Nanny followed, calm as can be, and I had my girl back. Kitty could either be the most lovable, snuggly girl in the world, or the most pissed off. She'd be sitting on your lap, purring away with pure love, and eventually she'd get pissed off at the movement of your stomach as you breathed. She'd start to do that low cat growl. And eventually, you'd get annoyed yourself and say, "Well, go then!" And she'd slump off, hissing and growling and furious at you for disturbing her sleep. She could just be like that. She was an outdoor cat, and we got her a little collar with a bell on it so the poor birds of the neighborhood could hear her coming. She had tapeworms countless times, which sent poor Mum reeling with despair and revulsion every time I'd say, "I think Kitty has a tapeworm again." One time Kitty came home and something was very, very wrong. She was drooling and only turning slowly to one side. I was in a panic. Dad raced her off to the late-night emergency vet. The vet figured she had been poisoned. He gave her some medicine, but he couldn't guarantee she would live. Somehow she recovered, but we were all horrified at the thought that people could hate cats so much that they'd put out poisoned food. Maybe that wasn't the case. Maybe one of the neighbors had sprayed their lawn or garden with chemicals and she'd gotten into it. We just didn't know. Another time, Kitty came home with the side of her face completely puffed out. Something had punctured it. This required medicine as well. Life wasn't exactly the nicest for outdoor cats, but she'd come to us as an outdoor cat, and she wouldn't be deterred from having her cat freedom. I could go into the backyard and yell, "Kitty!" Wait a moment, and hear that bell jingling off in the distance as she came running for home. Sometimes, though, she wouldn't come home when it was time to be in for the night, and this was a real pain in the ass in the summer, because we'd be trying to sleep and she'd be outside on the awning under our bedroom windows on the second floor, yowling at us through the screen to be let in. I'd have to get out of bed, all groggy, and go stand bleary in the moonlight outside the back door, trying to yell, "Kitty!" somehow without disturbing the neighbors. Brother was not interested in going downstairs and standing outside, so he'd simply take his window apart enough to let her in from there, and then she'd just come into my room and bug me. She could be the most lovable girl, though, and I was completely devastated when she got an aggressive tongue cancer and then had to be put to sleep 14 years later. She was a crazy cat who had never been spayed but never got pregnant, and we all joked that it was because she hated other cats. She wasn't particularly enthused about Sister Sheltie, but she would headbutt him sometimes affectionately. He never knew how to react in that case. He was always dying to play with her, but she was not interested. She would swat him and give him a smack from time to time, but interestingly, she never had her claws out when she did it. He would scratch at the door and whine to us or do a low woof when she was outside waiting to be let in and we hadn't noticed. I wasn't much of a dog person, but Woody was such a good boy. I know, it sounds like such a jerk thing to say, but I think it's because of my experiences from childhood. Like I said, dogs were often out on the loose in those years, and it could be very scary. Also, and I hate to say it, nearly every pet dog I knew as a kid, aside from Spooky, did not give me the best impression of dogs. And of course, there was Fluffy, who lived at Grandma's, the most ironically named dog of all time. So with all those dogs, plus big scary dogs on the loose in the neighborhood, plus a slew of other dogs that were always furiously barking when you came over to someone's house, and someone at that house was shouting at the dog to stay down or shut up, and quickly wrestling that dog somewhere behind a closed door, I generally assumed for my safety, and then insisting that their dog, despite the aggressive guard dog barking, was friendly, or don't worry, he won't bite. Plus the dog that destroyed our ducks and bunnies, well, I never really was much of a dog person. Sister was, though, and she begged and begged for a dog, and even wrote a highly convincing, pleading, essay-length letter request to my parents for a dog. They relented, and the dog acquiring process began. God, Woody was cute. He was a purebred and could have been a show dog, technically, if his white ruff of fur had gone all the way around his entire neck. He was bigger and brawnier than most Shelties, and had a boxier, cuter face than most. Technically, he was a bit of a nuisance because he would never stop barking when people came over, but he was just a good, lovable boy, often bumbling around the yard all day when Dad was outside doing yard work or projects, as Spooky had done before him. By the time Woody suffered the inevitable, heartbreaking health problems of old age that eventually ended with that awful final trip to the vets, Mom truly had had enough of pets and the heartbreak they brought. She loved Woody too, and I don't think any of our pets had a peaceful, undramatic ending. She'd had it, and Woody was the last of our family pets. None of us kids lived at home anymore, so there was nobody around to browbeat Mom into a new furry or feathered family member. I get Mom's feelings on this. I loved my cats. I had my little Ebony girl for 20 years, the last few of which were completely draining. I don't know if I'll ever get another pet. When those little furry souls die, it takes a lot out of you, that's for sure. Thoughts. Hey Karen, how's the emotional purging going? Sometimes it is truly awful. You mean reliving all this stuff? Yeah, it's like over 30 years later and I'm in bed crying over those poor ducks and bunnies one morning. So, why bother? Because I never realized how long this stuff has actually been sitting inside me, causing pain like some long dormant illness. What's the difference between healing these things and simply reliving them over and over again? I think it's that this time I'm truly seeing it, truly acknowledging it for how awful it was, how impactful. But something amazing is happening as I move through everything. What is that? I'm strong now. I get stronger each time I face a new shadow. Well, a new old shadow. It makes me feel it all again, and for a while it's like I'm stuck in that time again, that event, that era. It kind of makes me think of actors who take on very challenging characters and how emotionally they can't detach from that character while they're making the movie, and it messes with them a bit. It's like I had to think and feel like teen Karen for a while again. I even wanted to start using all that awful derogatory language of the 80s again. I was immersed in it. And now I'm walking around with the ghosts of those poor pets hovering around me. That sounds terrible. Why would you subject yourself to this? It does me no good hanging on to this sadness, these sadnesses. And like I said, I'm strong now and continuously getting stronger. I acknowledge everything with love and I let it go. I just fucking let it go. It feels so good. It feels so light. It's so hard thinking about it again, but damn, it feels so good to set it free. It's like having a to-do list of very tedious chores and checking them off one by one. It's not fun to clean the bathroom and scrub the toilet, but when you're standing back in the doorway and the room is so gleaming and clean, it feels so good. It's hard, but it's good and so worth it. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think you're amazing. I am. I fucking am.